A.T.C. Barragoola. Barragoola on Cape York Peninsula, Queensland, like a number of other places still shown on maps of the region, but which in fact have long since ceased to exist as human habitations, had been quite a town, a 20-pub town, to describe it according to district usage in declaring the prosperity of old mining towns of the north. But all that remained of the glory that had been Barragoola's was a street of creaking rusty ruins, mostly collapsed through the ravages of termite, tempest, and fire, some splendid heaps of bottles, and a flock of lonely goats. How the goats hung on there, resisting the murderous attacks of the dingoes, was a mystery. Perhaps they were sustained by the hope of the eventual return of men, their only friends. That seemed not unlikely, the way they would come running, crying their joy whenever a human came among them. As Barragoola lay a long way off the main road to Cowan, the center of such civilization as there is on the peninsula, the goats saw few humans. That is before the new era of human interest in the place with which this narrative deals. Earlier, the only people who had passed that way were those going to and from the couple of cattle stations away to eastward, and odd prospectors. Even these had become rarer. Station people had taken to traveling by air, and the ranks of prospectors has dwindled with the passing of old-time methods of mining. Not that the new era brought so much consolation to the goats, because it really didn't affect the town at all. Certainly Barragoola was put back on the map as a reality instead of a memory, but as an aerodrome now, not as a town. The Barragoola aerodrome owed its existence to the fortunes of war. It had been constructed during the Pacific War for use in emergency. The peculiar meteorological conditions that build up over the mountains to eastward and southward often forced back aircraft flying down the peninsula to cairns. During the early part of the campaign, planes of the Australian and U.S. services were lost in the vicinity for want of facilities for emergency landing, so an airstrip had been laid, built with all the wartime heedlessness of cost. It was its very excellence to preserve which would entail expense, out of keeping with peacetime economics, that had caused the authorities to let Barragoola aerodrome become extinct with the town it was named for. In that state it had lain for years, slowly identifying itself again with the wilderness through the encroachment of grass and scrub and ant hill, till suddenly it was brought back into service by him who came to be called A.T.C. Barragoola, otherwise known as Nathaniel Ahmat. A.T.C., meaning Air Traffic Controller, is the title of those officers of the Department of Civil Aviation responsible for controlling aerial traffic. Such officers operate only in centers where such traffic is concentrated. Old Nat Ahmat, operating his salvaged airport away in the wilderness, was given the title in affectionate jocularity by the bush pilots whose unofficial convenience he served. Actually, he held no official post at all, nor until the day when drastic circumstances caused him to put the Barragoola airstrip back into service, had even had any part in aviation. It was as a prospector that old Nat had come to Barragoola, to hole up there during the wet season while working in the gully for the bit of gold, always uncovered by the rains. One morning, at his sluicing down by the old battery, he heard an aircraft flying low, and took a look to see indistinct in the cloud rack a light plane circling the old aerodrome. As he learnt later, the plane came in almost out of fuel from battling to cross the mountains, because the aerodrome was half a mile away with the ruins of the town intervening. He did not see what happened when the aircraft landed, but he heard it and leapt into his battered truck and drove as he had never dared drive that old wreck before. Had he not acted thus, the two occupants of the plane would certainly have perished, for in landing it hit an ant hill, smashed its undercarriage, crumpled up and rolling over, then burst into flames. There was much more to the rescue of those two men than simply dragging them from the burning wreck. They both had broken legs, besides other injuries, and must be got to hospital as soon as possible. Travel by truck just then, when the clay pans were quagmires and the creeks torrents, was out of the question. The one thing to do was get the aerial ambulance. This meant first clearing the runway to some degree. Old Nat accomplished it by laboring like 10 men throughout the remaining hours of daylight of that eventful day. Then, when a man of his slight build and advanced years should have been resting from such effort, he set out on foot, in pouring rain, for Lilyvale Station, the nearest point on the telegraph line, 25 miles west of Barragoola. Even after that further epic effort, he wouldn't rest, but borrowing a horse from Lilyvale, rode right back. He had the satisfaction next morning of seeing the aerial ambulance make a safe, if somewhat rough landing, and after some more work on the strip of the crew, a good takeoff. In taking leave of him, the men he had rescued declared that as soon as they were on their feet again, and had something to fly in, they would be back with a load of beer. They were prospectors, too, of the modern kind, aerial geologists employed by a big mining concern. Old Nat got the first taste of that promised beer a couple of days after the declaration was made concerning it, when the aerial ambulance again flew into Barragoola, this time bringing a civil aviation inspector to investigate the crash, as well as a couple of newspaper reporters. A week later, the aerial ambulance dropped in at Barragoola again, this time simply to let old Nat know that he had become a national hero. No doubt, by the time he heard about his fame, the nation had forgotten it, but there it was, made permanent in print and pictures. Eventually, those records were put into picture frames scrounged from the ruins of the town, and were hung in the house Nat built beside the aerodrome when he entered upon his duties as A.T.C. His initiation into these duties was due to those geological aeronauts who owed their lives to him. The pair came back, as promised, some 6 weeks after making his acquaintance. They told him that they intended to operate in the area during the coming dry season, and offered him the job of keeping the runway in service and cooking for them. They had heard of his excellent cooking from the pilots of the aerial ambulance, who by that time were making a habit of dropping in at Barragoola whenever opportunity offered. Eventually, the pilots of all the other light aircraft operating in the region were doing likewise. Bush pilots are a starved tribe and on the go, as they are from first light to last, if not too busy to eat, then too tired. Nat's culinary specialties were camp oven roasts of the provender of the locality, kid goat, or wild duck or goose taken off the billabong that had been the town dam, or fat bustard out of the gully, served with the sweet bucks and pumpkin he grew. As a cook, he could have made a much easier and far more lucrative living than he had had as a prospector. In fact, in his long pursuit of the elusive nugget, he had often to do a spell of cooking on some cattle station or in some mining camp in order to acquit himself financially. He might have had a permanent job cooking anywhere he liked, with the best of living conditions. When asked why he preferred to suffer the hardships of prospecting, he would reply, blinking his mongoloid eyes and pulling at his mandarin's mustache, "Ah, the outdoor life suits me." The fact of the matter was that he was by nature unsuited for cooking as a calling, at any rate for cooking in the bush, where dealing with forthright characters in the raw state of hunger calls for forthrightness of a special kind. Those who knew Nat Amat for the amiable and retiring old fellow that he was should have known better than to ask him that question. But why prefer prospecting to any other pursuit? Lone prospectors, for all their propensity for living in solitude, are not usually of the retiring type, as witness the lavish good fellowship they invariably show when they make a strike, and that truculent misanthropy of their disappointed age, which earns them such names as Mad Hatter, Death Adder, Scrubbull. Prospectors are essentially dreamers, dreaming of a state of perfect existence to be won with the finding of the pot of gold at the rainbow's end. They crowd their solitude with their dreaming. They do not want company unless they may shine in it. Na Amat was like that, for all his insignificance of personality and smiling self-effacement. Probably his complex of inferiority stemmed from his being of mongrel breed. What exactly his breed was, no one knew. He was not native to the region, and avoided a discussion of his antecedents. Certainly he had Chinese blood, and some other that made him copper-skinned, perhaps aboriginal. His deep need to shine was surely proved by the way he seized upon that first bit of importance he had had in his 65 years and more, and perpetuated it by framing the evidence on his wall. Nat had never flown before he became involved with the flying fraternity there at Barragoola. He took his first flight off the Barragoola runway with one of those pilots he had rescued. The effect on him was profound, summed up in his comment, "To think a man's been crawling about the country like a blooming goanna, when he coulda been flying over it like a heagle." It was in the style of an eagle that he got about the country. Subsequently, by the time his friends, the flying geologists, left the district, Barragoola had become included in the radio network of the aerial ambulance. He had only to ask for transport, and the first ambulance or charter aircraft passing that way with a seat to spare would call for him. When his job with the geologist was worked out, he applied for the old age pension. He always flew to Cohen to collect his dues. Sometimes his flying took him to the limits of the region, to Cairns, to Thursday Island. He came to talk aviation like one of the fraternity, so that his cronies in Cohen would say to him in greeting, "Well, how's the flying game, Nat?" and would wink at each other while, innocent of being strung along, he discoursed in his ponderous way. Not that he was really regarded as a figure of fun, What his cronies truly felt about him was revealed in their saying among themselves that it was good to see a lonely old fellow so happily occupied. He still lived very much alone by the general standard, even though he might expect his aeronautical friends to drop in on him at least once a week. He could rarely hold them for much longer than it took to feed them. Certainly, these brief visits, filled with engine noise and the inevitable vocal exuberance of aeronauts, were lively enough to dispel the effects of a week of solitude. The trouble was that the solitude closed in heavier than ever for having been so rudely dealt with. At least, that was how it might well seem to anyone of ordinary sociability. That was how it did seem to one of his earthbound visitors, a prospector named Ben Larkin, who remarked to Nat after seeing the aerial ambulance off with him, "The quiet kind o' comes down and belts you under the ear'ole, don't it? It's a wonder you don't get the Dingwillies livin' 'ere on your Pat Malone." There was nothing of the solitary about Ben Larkin, despite his calling. Ben declared that he hated solitude, that he never worked without a mate, that he had endured life in the wilderness only in the hope of acquiring means to live among people in what he called style. He claimed to have made several rich strikes in his career, and to have lived up every penny. Even now, about to go on the old age pension, he was planning a lively future in some place where there would be good company as well as good fishing and good living, say Cooktown or Port Douglas, his hope of the wherewithal to do things in style being centered in the Golden Casket lottery. He had just parted with his last mate, whom he had put dying aboard the aerial ambulance over at Cassowary Station in the mountains. He had dropped in on Nat, of whom he had heard while passing through in his old utility on the way to Cohen. There was no winking when Nat talked aviation to Ben Larkin, and it was not simply because there was no one to wink at out there at Barragoola, save the kites perched on the goat yard fence, but because old Ben was genuinely interested, as he put it to himself. "I likes to learn new things. I got no proper schooling. My time, all they was to learn was connected with hard yakker. Tell me, man, what makes them things fly with no visible means of support? I've often wondered." When Nat had demonstrated the theory of flight as he had had it himself from the experts, using sheets of paper to show how lift results from the flow of air over a convex surface, old Ben's faded blue eyes shone in his ruddy face, and he brought down a great red fist, exclaiming, "Well, what do you know about that?" And he spent hours playing with sheets of paper on his own. Ben stayed on at Barragoola, right welcome in the beginning because of his frank pleasure in his host's all-abiding interest, and no less at home there even when it should have been obvious to him that the welcome had worn pretty thin. Flattered by Ben's seeking to share his interest, Nat eagerly showed him how to make an estimation of the weather and give the daily report over the radio. So interested was Ben that he assumed the role of assistant A.T.C, and such his disposition that he failed to realize that his cooperation was being resented. Ben also cooperated in entertaining the visiting aeronauts, or rather took over that department from Nat, except in the matter of feeding them. It was natural that he should do so, being of so much more forceful character than Nat. Poor Nat became simply the cook. As a broad hint of his feelings, Nat drastically reduced the quality of the meals he prepared for Ben and himself, but it had little or no effect. Ben only said, "A man getting up in years ought o' eat sparingly. I read where rich food gives you hardening the arteries." Nevertheless, when the good food was on for the pilots, he shared it with gusto. Nat took to reminding him of the essentially transient nature of his interest in what went on at Barragoola by talking of those places Ben had mentioned when speaking of his retirement, Cooktown and Port Douglas, and by stressing the fact that Ben would have to consider the matter of the weather in traveling. Nat said, "You'll have to get a move on if you don't want to have to hole up in Cohen for the wet." No suggestion of holding up at Barragoola. Ben always answered that he would get going when the spirit moved him, and sounded genuine enough in his intention to go. If further proof were needed of that intention, it was surely to be found in his continual harping on what he considered Nat's folly in working as he did without reward. He would say emphatically, "Not for mine, man, not for mine." Still Nat fretted in his ineffectual way, perhaps because he knew there was a reward beyond reckoning, and it only remained for Ben to discover it to make the usurpation complete. The reward, of course, was flying with the aeronauts. Old Ben discovered it was a charter aircraft dropped in to take Nat up to Cohen to collect his pension. Ben went along too, not at the invitation of Nat, but of the pilot, who, taken by his exuberant interest, had him up in front with him, leaving Nat to sit behind. Ben had flown before, but never with a pilot who took him up for a peep into the black caverns of a thunderhead, or down to see lotus birds running on the lily pads of billabongs, who let him try his hand with dual control, as he said in the pub at Cohen after landing from that fabulous flight, speaking to the habitués while Nat hung unnoticed in the background. "I felt like a millionaire flying me own hairy plane." There followed another millionaire's flight back to Barragoola. Old Nat was completely out of it, even while he cooked the dinner. Ben and the pilot were outside, studying the threatening sky, talking Kunim, condensation level, supercooling. Nat peered out at them with mongoloid eyes drawn down in misery. When the pilot took leave of them, it was only too clear that he gave the thumbs-up sign to Ben. "Nice laddie that," Ben shouted above the din of the departure. Then, as the uproar receded, with the planes running to the strip, he added, "Nice laddies, all of 'em, princes among men. If I had me time over again, I'd be one of 'em." They watched the takeoff, waiting for the inevitable beat up, waved a last farewell, and stood to watch the silver bird climb into the sky to southward and vanish in the clouds. As the silence came down, Ben said, "Gosh, the quiet." Then he cocked an eye at a thunderhead rearing over the mountains to eastward, saying, 20,000 foot, oh, Kunim, there 20,000 foot, oh, steam and electricity all ready to bust. Amazing, ain't it?" For the first time in a long while, Nat spoke, in a voice vibrant with repressed feeling. "The stormer comin' up. You'll have to be getting away from 'ere this week, or you'll be bogged down 'fore you gets to Cohen even." Ben eyed him for a moment, then clapped him on the shoulder, saying with a chuckle, "I ain't thinkin' o' travelin' no more, mate. I made up me mind to stay right on 'ere with you. Nat blinked, gasped, "Eh?" The big red hand on Nat's thin shoulder ground him down with rough affection, as its owner declared himself. "You need a mate. It ain't good for a man to spend all the time you do here on your pat." Staggering under the pressure of affection, Nat gasped, "I like being on me own. What with that old town just over there creaking and groaning in the wind like all the ghosts o' all the poor devils that must a died here in the oars was gathered for a corroboree, and dingoes howling and goats yelling blue murder in the middle of night. It ain't natural, man, it just ain't natural. Anybody living without company's doomed to finish up a hatter, and I ain't goin' a let you see. I get plenty company. Company o' goats and kite-hawks sittin' on the fence. That's hatter's company. It ain't natural, I say. 'Sides, you gettin' well on in years. What say you took sick sudden? I got the radio and the hambulance. What if you took a fit or somethin' out on the strip there? You'd just have to lie there for the ants and the crows and the dingoes. What if you got bit by a snake? You won't get to no radio with a tappin' bite." Ben dropped his arm about the drooping shoulders and gave Nat a bear's hug, saying, "No, mate, I don't want to go buttin' in on you if you don't want me. But I reckon you do want me. You only got the adder rabbit, that's all. You's so used to bein' alone, you gets frightened o' company. We been good mates, ain't we? We got the same hinterest. We like this 'ere flying game and the boys in it. We got that to talk about and read about when we's alone. If eventually we find we don't get along so good, well, all you gotta do is tell me get the hell out of here. It's a bargain, eh?" Ben grabbed for Nat's hand and shook it. How Nat truly felt about it he hadn't words to say, which was unfortunate when Ben was one to set store only on what a man had the spirit to declare of his feelings. Although throughout the day that followed Nat remained as glum as he had been rendered by that first declaration of Ben's permanence in his life, Ben talked and acted much the same as always. Ben liked to read bits out of the stack of papers and magazines they had. He kept it up, mostly indifferent to Nat's attention, but right ready to demand it if he wanted it. Ben also liked to sit outside after supper and watch the gathering of evening while he talked. It was a ritual with him. He kept that up too, even though now he mostly had to hunt old Nat out of the house, chiding him, "Hey, what you doin' pokin' 'bout in corners in the dark like a holed porcupine huntin' for white ants? Come on out into the fresh air, man, and 'ave a yarn. Nobody ought not be alone at the end of the day. It makes 'em miserable." Ben did concede this much to his host's undeclared resentment, that he didn't now demand a share in the semi-official working of the place. Now that he withdrew, he just had to put his spoke into the weather estimate, and must always hang over Nat's shoulder while he talked on the radio. But to limit his activities, only that much was certainly a concession. Whether he would have behaved with similar restraint in dealing with aeronautical visitors was not put to the test, because during the week the only aircraft to visit them merely did a turn and dropped a bundle of papers, and at the end of it things came to a head. It was mid-morning. Nat had just made his weather estimate and was about to put it over the radio. Ben, as ever at his elbow, said, "How about letting me do the weather tomorrow, mate?" Nat started, swung on him. Ben went on, "You been doing it a whole week. get bit monotonous and not having something to do what's necessary like. The significance of Nat's haggard looks was lost on Ben, who went on with undiminished cheerfulness. How about we take it week and week about? Doing the weather for a week at a time would give a man better idea what he's doing than chopping and changing from day to day, don't you reckon? Nat suddenly thrust the screed he had in his hand at Ben, gasping, "'Ere, take it." Ben took it, saying in surprise, "Tomorrow'll do." Nat rushed out of the radio room. Ben went after him, found him in the kitchen, getting his butchering kit down from the wall. Ben demanded, "What's wrong with you, man? What you doing?" Nat was panting, "Going to kill a goat. You gotta put this report over. I'm finished reporting. You can do it for good." "What's got into you, man? You'd better hurry. They'll be waiting." Nat disappeared through the back door. Ben stood for a moment, scratching the white stubble of his red chin, then shrugged and went back to the radio. The radio kept Ben for an hour or more. When he came looking for Nat, he found him over by the goat yard with a carcass hanging from a limb of the butchering tree, working before an audience of kites perched on the fence. As if nothing had happened, Ben squatted in the shade to relate the gossip of the air. Nat worked on, silent, stony-faced. The only variation in the routine of the morning was Nat's putting on a haunch and a shoulder of goat to bake while he grilled chops and kidneys for midday dinner. Usually he hung joints for cooking next day, but Ben, following him about, talking all the while, didn't seem to notice. After dinner, they retired as usual to their respective rooms for siesta. At least Ben retired for siesta. Nat simply sat on his bed, staring out into the blazing yard through the shutter that opened up from ground level. He sat thus till he heard Ben snore. Then he rose swiftly and began to gather together his belongings, to pack them into a tin trunk and roll them into the swag he made of his bedding. These he put outside through the shutter, then slipped out and took them to his truck in the shed. There were more things to get, cooking gear and food, including the roast when they were done, and those framed cuttings, and his prospecting tools. He worked swiftly and silently, evidently wanting to get away before Ben awoke. He might have got away without fuss but for having, as he found, upon making a final check, a flat front tire. He was flogging the pump when Ben came into the shed saying, "Hello, going for water, eh?" During the dry, they had to cart their water from the dam. Nat didn't answer, but bent swiftly to release the pump, even though the tire was only half inflated. Then Ben saw that the truck was loaded. "Hey, what's the idea?" Nat pitched the pump into the doorless cabin and slipped in behind the wheel. Ben came barging up to him. "Where are you off to?" Fiddling with switch and choke, Nat muttered, "Going back prospecting." Don't be mad. What's bit you, man?" "Just feel like a change," the starter growled. Ben cried, "You can't go running away. You got a job here to do. You can do it." The old engine started with a pop, a bang, stuttered into a roar, filling the shed with smoke. Above the den, Ben roared, wait a minute. We gotta talk this out. I offended you or something, eh?" Nat slipped into gear, the gears ground, and the truck moved. Ben clung to it as if to hold it back. He went with it, shouting, wait a minute. I ain't staying here without no mate. Wait. Which way you going?" Clearing the shed, Nat yelled, "Cassowary way. Ain't nothing to find out there. Never know your luck. Stop. Wait till tomorrow. I'll come with you. I like working on me own. I know a couple of likely prospects. Wait till tomorrow. Might be raining tomorrow. Ben was running, clinging, panting. Don't go, man. Please don't go leaving me, mate. Mate. Hooray. Ben was left behind, lost in red dust. Nat drove the few hundred yards into the main street of the town to turn left and run on northward through the double line of ruins, gaping through broken windows and wrecked doors, past live goats that came forth from hiding, bleating welcome, past dead goats lying where the dingoes had dragged them down by night and left them as husks for the kites that now, heavy with gorgement, struggled up into guilty flight. Nat drove through the town to the junction where the road to Lilyvale and Cohen ran westward, and that to Cassowary Station eastward. It was to the east he turned, to run down past the battery into the gully, then to turn southward and proceed along a rough track on the western side of the gully, heading for the crossing to the east. Rough as the track was, it was not so much as to cause the difficulty with steering he was having. When he reached the crossing, he stopped and took a look. The front tire he had partially inflated was dead flat again, and he had no spare wheel. There was nothing for it but to get out the puncture outfit. It was no easy job, dealing with burred old bolts and an old-fashioned spring rim that at first refused to unlock, and then behaved likewise in the matter of locking. The time passed, the sun went beyond the gully, then the sky above the western rampart flamed with ruby and gold and amethyst. Back at the aerodrome, old Ben would be sitting out on his favorite box, smoking, talking this evening to the kites gathered for the night on the goat-yard fence. A dingo mourned away to the southward, to be answered in a moment by a mate away to eastward. The goats would be cowering back into the ruins of the town. At last Nat had the job done. The wheel back and only needing to be bolted. He was scratching round in the dust for the nuts and washers when a far-off sound caught his attention. It was a faint droning, an engine sound, coming on the evening breeze from westward. He cocked his eye skyward, but the sound hadn't the music in it of an aero engine. Apparently that dawned on him. He turned from the truck and began to climb straight up out of the gully. He reached the top, out of breath, to stand heaving and slavering, staring across the town at the aerodrome. It was from Ben Larkin's utility that the sound came. There it was now, running through the ruins and the goats, down to the road junction, there to turn westward towards Lilyvale. Cohen. For a while Nat watched the golden dust of old Ben's progress. Then, with a sigh, he turned his gaze upon the aerodrome, where the white windsock floated gently in the evening breeze, strangely distinct in that roseate aureate glowing, and likewise the cozy cluster of whitewashed buildings beneath the radio masts, headquarters of A.T.C. Barragoola.